One of the hardest truths to accept about avoidant personalities is this: they don't open up because they don't feel safe. They don't admit love because love to them feels like danger. It's not that they don't feel deeply. They do, but they've learned, often early in life, that closeness equals loss of control. So when we talk about why an avoidant finally admits love, we're really talking about what it takes to make them feel safe enough to drop the mask. Emotional safety is the gatekeeper to vulnerability. Most people misunderstand this. They think if they can just love harder, prove their devotion, or break down the avoidance walls, that'll be enough. But love doesn't land on a guarded heart. The harder you push, the tighter they close the door. What actually changes the dynamic is not pressure, it's safety. When an avoidant starts to sense that you don't want to consume them, that you're not a threat to their autonomy, something shifts. Their nervous system starts to calm down. That's when they begin to see that love doesn't have to equal loss. See, avoidants operate from a deep, often unconscious fear of engulfment. The fear that if they let someone in, they'll lose their independence or be emotionally overpowered. It's a survival instinct rooted in early experiences where closeness wasn't safe. Maybe affection was inconsistent or boundaries were ignored. Over time, but they equate intimacy with being controlled. So when someone comes along who feels emotionally steady, who doesn't demand constant reassurance or push for closeness too soon, the avoidant's nervous system starts to register anew patterns. This is different. I can breathe here. That's the first step toward real connection. Safety, not chemistry, not intensity, safety. Because intensity to an avoidant feels like chaos, but calm presence, that feels like oxygen. It allows their defenses to soften little by little. And that's when you'll start noticing subtle shifts, longer eye contact, more honest communication, a willingness to stay instead of withdraw. These are the early signs of emotional trust forming, and it's trust, not attraction, that paves the way for love to be admitted. When an avoidant finally says, "I love you," it's rarely spontaneous. It's not the product of a single romantic moment. It's the result of accumulated safety. Dozens of small, consistent moments where they felt seen, respected, and free to just be. Think about that. Freedom and safety coexist for them in a way most people overlook. If love feels like a trap, they'll run. But if love feels like freedom, they'll stay. And here's the paradox. The moment you stop chasing their love is the moment you start creating the safety they need to feel it. Because you're no longer confirming their fear that intimacy means control. You're modeling something healthier. You're showing them that love can stand on 2 feet, not one person leaning on the other. You're proving that connection can be chosen, not coerced. Psychologically speaking, that shift changes everything. It moves the relationship dynamic from anxiety to security, from proving to allowing, from chasing to attracting. And the avoidant, for perhaps the first time, experiences intimacy without panic. That's when the confession comes. Not because they were persuaded, but because their defenses finally feel unnecessary. It's worth noting that emotional safety doesn't mean you tolerate neglect or accept emotional distance forever. It's about balance, holding boundaries while remaining grounded. It's saying, I can love you and still love myself. I can give you space without abandoning who I am. That energy creates stability, and stability is what avoidants crave, even when they act like they don't. So the real question isn't, how do I make them admit they love me? The question is, how do I create the kind of environment where love can safely emerge? Because if you can do that, you're not just helping the avoidant heal. You're transforming the entire dynamic into something more conscious, more stable, more real. In a world obsessed with instant gratification, it takes real courage to slow down and build safety first. But that's exactly what love demands of us, to be the kind of person who makes others feel free, not frightened. And maybe that's the deeper lesson here. Avoidants only admit love when love stops feeling like a threat. When it stops sounding like, you need to love me, and starts sounding like, you're safe to love me. Because the truth is, safety is what allows love to breathe. Consistency is the quiet force that dismantles an avoidance fear. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's steady. And steady is exactly what their nervous system doesn't know how to handle, because consistency has never been part of their emotional vocabulary. You see, most avoidant individuals grew up in environments where connection came with conditions. Love was available one moment, withdrawn the next. Attention was earned through performance, not presence. So they learned early on that stability isn't real, that people eventually leave, and that the safest thing to do is to depend only on themselves. So imagine what happens when someone comes along and doesn't play that game. When someone doesn't chase them after a withdrawal, doesn't punish them for pulling away, and doesn't beg for reassurance every time things feel uncertain. At first, the avoidant doesn't trust it. In fact, your consistency might irritate them. It confuses their defense system because it doesn't fit the pattern they're wired to expect. They'll test it. They'll push boundaries, disappear, come back, maybe even provoke emotional reactions just to see if you'll break your own pattern of calm. And that's where most people lose them, not because they don't care, but because they interpret the testing as rejection instead of fear. What's actually happening beneath the surface is that the avoidant is asking, can I trust you to stay steady when I get scared? They don't have the language for it, but that's the emotional message. Every time you stay grounded, every time you respond instead of react, you're reprogramming their nervous system to see that closeness doesn't always equal chaos. Consistency, in this sense, is not just about behavior. It's about energy. It's about maintaining emotional predictability even when they're unpredictable. It's about not taking their distance personally, because it rarely is. They're not pulling away from you. They're pulling away from what intimacy represents to them. Vulnerability, potential loss, exposure. When you can hold your center in that moment, you're showing them something revolutionary, that love can survive space, silence, and even discomfort. That's where the transformation happens. The avoidant begins to internalize a new truth, that love can be stable, and that's when their guard starts to lower. You'll notice it not through grand gestures, but through micro moments. A text that's a little more open, a conversation that goes a little deeper, a glance that lingers longer. These subtle cues are their way of inching closer to safety, of testing the water of emotional intimacy without drowning in it. Philosophically, it's fascinating because consistency is the opposite of what most people do when they feel insecure. When someone withdraws, our instinct is to chase. When we feel ignored, we protest. When we sense emotional distance, we demand closeness. But all those reactions confirm the avoidant's deepest fear, that intimacy means loss of control. Consistency flips that narrative. It's a quiet form of strength. It says, I'm here, but I'm not here to consume you. I can care for you without needing to control you. And that balance, presence without pressure, is magnetic to the avoidant mind. It allows them to feel connected without feeling trapped. That's when trust begins to take root. Trust is not built through intensity, it's built through repetition. through showing up again and again in a way that aligns with your words, through proving that your love doesn't come with hidden contracts or emotional ransom. When they start to see that your stability doesn't waver when they pull away, they start to believe that maybe this love is different. Maybe it's safe. Maybe they don't have to run anymore. But here's the key. Consistency doesn't mean overextending yourself or waiting forever for someone to meet you halfway. It's about maintaining emotional self-control while holding your boundaries. It's saying, I can be calm and kind, but I won't chase chaos. It's not endurance, it's self-respect in motion. You're not proving your worth. You're modeling what healthy connection looks like. And that modeling is exactly what helps an avoidant slowly recalibrate their emotional compass. The irony is that once they start to trust your consistency, they begin to mirror it. Their nervous system starts to relax. They reach out sooner. They recover from conflict faster. The relationship begins to move from survival mode to connection mode, because now love doesn't feel like a roller coaster. It feels like a rhythm. Predictable, grounded, and real. And maybe that's the deeper point. Consistency doesn't just heal the avoidant. It heals you too. It teaches you that love isn't about control or reaction. It's about stability, self-awareness, and emotional regulation. It's about becoming the kind of person who brings calm into connection rather than chaos. So if you're with someone who's avoidant, stop trying to break their walls down. Just stop. You don't need to break through. You need to outlast the fear. Keep showing up as who you say you are. Keep your boundaries clean and your emotions grounded. That's how you prove, not through words but through energy, that love can be safe, that intimacy can coexist with freedom. There's this fascinating paradox when it comes to avoidant personalities. They often realize what they feel only when they start to lose what they've taken for granted. It's not because they don't care, and it's not because they're incapable of love. It's because their emotional awareness is often buried beneath layers of control. Avoidants rely on control to feel safe. It's their armor against uncertainty, intimacy, and vulnerability. As long as they can keep emotional distance, they can maintain the illusion that they're not dependent on anyone. But when that control starts to slip, when you pull back, when you stop chasing, when you stop making love a guaranteed presence, they're forced to face something they've spent their whole lives avoiding, the truth of their own attachment. Losing control exposes them to a mirror they've been avoiding. Suddenly, the absence of your energy, your attention, your consistency, it hits them in a way that words never could. They begin to feel what they've been intellectualizing for years. That's the moment when realization starts to form, when the mind's protective logic starts to break down and emotion takes the driver's seat. They start to notice the quiet moments where they used to feel secure in your presence. They start to replay old conversations, the things you said that they brushed off. It's not nostalgia, it's awakening. Because emotional distance doesn't just protect them from pain, it also numbs them to love. And when that distance collapses, the numbness fades, and suddenly they can feel everything they tried so hard to suppress. This moment of loss, of losing control, is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the silence after you stop texting. It's the shift in your tone when you finally prioritize yourself. It's the space you create when you decide that loving someone shouldn't mean losing yourself. That space is what brings them face to face with the emotional consequences of their avoidance. And for the first time, they realize that love isn't suffocating. It's something they actually need, something they've been running from out of fear, not logic. Psychologically, this happens because avoidance is a defense mechanism, not an identity. It's a learned response rooted in self-protection. When an avoidant senses loss, it bypasses their rational filters and activates their attachment system, the part of them that still craves connection, no matter how much they deny it. They can't reason their way out of that. The human brain doesn't negotiate with emotional truth. It simply feels it. And that's when the internal conflict begins, the part of them that wants control versus the part of them that finally admits, I care. It's uncomfortable for them, deeply so. Love for an avoidant often arrives disguised as anxiety. The closer they get to acknowledging it, the more exposed they feel. But losing control disrupts their coping pattern. It forces integration. They can no longer pretend they're unaffected when the absence of your presence starts to ache. That's when love stops being an idea and starts being real. And here's where your role becomes critical, not in trying to pull them back in, but in maintaining your own center. Because that's the real catalyst for their growth. When you detach from needing to be chosen, you give them the emotional space to choose you freely. When you stop trying to manage their emotions, you break the codependent dynamic that kept their defenses alive. You stop feeding the fear loop. And paradoxically, it's in that moment of letting go that they finally start to feel the loss. Not as punishment, but as perspective. You see, avoidance thrives on predictability. When they can predict that you'll always be there, no matter how far they pull away, they never have to confront what your absence would mean. But once that pattern breaks, they're forced to see love not as control, but as a privilege. The loss of control humbles them. It strips away the ego defenses and exposes the human underneath, the one who actually wants connection, but doesn't know how to sustain it. Philosophically, there's a deeper layer to this. Every human being, no matter how self-protective, must eventually confront the tension between freedom and connection. We want both, but the truth is, love requires a surrender of control, not a loss of self, but a willingness to be changed by closeness. For the avoidant, that surrender only happens when their illusion of control collapses. That's when love stops being a threat and starts being a truth. And maybe that's the heart of this whole process. Avoidants don't admit love because someone convinces them to. They admit it when reality convinces them, when the void left by your absence becomes undeniable, when the silence becomes louder than your presence ever was. It's not manipulation, it's natural consequence. You can't force that realization. You can only create the conditions where it happens. So when you stop chasing, when you reclaim your power, you're not punishing them. You're freeing both of you from a loop of fear. Because the moment they lose control is the moment they find clarity. They see love for what it truly is. Not an invasion, but an invitation. And that realization, once it lands, changes everything. There's something profoundly disarming about genuine acceptance. When you stop trying to fix, prove, or force connection, you create the kind of emotional environment that allows an avoidant to breathe. And that, right there, is when love starts to become possible. Because for someone who fears intimacy, acceptance isn't just comforting. It's revolutionary. It breaks a lifelong pattern of believing that love always comes with demands, conditions, or hidden expectations. Avoidants are used to relationships feeling like emotional negotiations. They've learned that closeness often means pressure. Pressure to open up, to be more available, to respond the way someone else wants them to. They equate love with the loss of autonomy. So when they encounter someone who offers love without control, compassion without demand, it's almost destabilizing at first. They don't know what to do with it. It feels foreign, like stepping into a quiet room after years of noise. And yet, that's exactly what starts to change them. True acceptance doesn't mean you tolerate neglect or avoid speaking your needs. It means you stop trying to make someone love you differently. You stop performing for approval. You stop measuring their affection to feel safe. You start letting things be what they are, and in that stillness, something powerful happens. You create a space where honesty can live. That space is where the avoidance defenses begin to lose their purpose. Because you're no longer fighting their walls, you're simply refusing to participate in the battle. You're not saying, "I need you to change so I can feel secure." You're saying, "I'm secure enough to let you be who you are, and I'll decide what that means for me." That emotional clarity is magnetic. It signals maturity, stability, and most importantly, safety. It tells the avoidance nervous system that you're not a threat to their independence, that love doesn't have to mean surrendering their identity. What most people misunderstand is that acceptance doesn't make you passive. It makes you powerful. You're not giving up on connection. You're changing the energy you bring to it. When you stop resisting reality, you stop feeding the dynamic that keeps you both stuck. The avoidant no longer has to defend against emotional invasion, and you no longer have to exhaust yourself trying to earn closeness. The relationship moves from push-pull to presence. Psychologically, this is profound because acceptance dismantles shame. Many avoidants carry unspoken shame about their inability to love the way others expect. They know they pull away. They know they struggle with emotional expression. And the more they're criticized for it, the deeper that shame burrows. When someone instead meets them with calm acceptance, that shame starts to loosen its grip. Acceptance says, "I see you. I understand you. You don't have to perform for me." And in that moment, something shifts inside them. They begin to see themselves as worthy of love, not in spite of their wiring, but as they are. This is where emotional healing begins, because when people feel seen without judgment, they stop needing to defend themselves. And when they stop defending, they start connecting. Acceptance becomes the emotional key that unlocks vulnerability. It's the difference between someone saying, "I'll love you if you change," and someone saying, "You're safe here, even while you're figuring it out." That message lands deeper than any grand declaration ever could. Now, acceptance doesn't mean you ignore your own needs. It means you balance empathy with boundaries. You can hold compassion for someone's fear without letting it dictate your worth. You can say, "I understand why you pull away," and still choose not to chase. That balance is what transforms acceptance from self-sacrifice into strength. It's what keeps love healthy instead of codependent. And here's the things, when an avoidant feels that kind of acceptance, they start to relax into the relationship instead of running from it. They test it less. They withdraw less. They begin to share more, reveal more, stay longer. Because finally, love feels safe. Not because it's perfect, but because it's peaceful. It's not a performance. It's permission. Permission to be flawed, to be human, to be loved without having to earn it. Philosophically, this kind of love redefines intimacy. It shifts the focus from changing someone to understanding them. It reminds us that love isn't about control. It's about capacity. The capacity to hold another person's truth without flinching. The capacity to love without trying to rewrite someone's emotional DNA. That's not easy. It takes patience, self-awareness, and emotional discipline. But it's also where real connection begins, at the intersection of compassion and autonomy. When you offer that kind of acceptance, you become the mirror that reflects a new possibility back to them. that love doesn't have to feel like captivity, that being close to someone doesn't mean losing yourself, that intimacy can coexist with individuality. For the avoidant, that realization is life-changing. It's what turns fear into trust and distance into devotion. So if you're in that position, loving someone who keeps you at arm's length, remember this: you don't have to convince them to let you in. You just have to stop proving and start allowing. Let them see that love isn't a test they have to pass. It's a space they can rest in. Emotional maturity is the quiet, invisible force that changes everything in a relationship with an avoidant. It's not about how much you love them. It's about how deeply you understand yourself while loving them. Because avoidants don't fall in love through persuasion, they fall in love through transformation. When the emotional landscape around them evolves from neediness and anxiety into calm, grounded independence, something inside them begins to shift. They start to see love not as a threat to their autonomy, but as an extension of it. For an avoidant, love has always been tied to loss. Loss of control, loss of space, loss of self. Their emotional walls were built to protect against those losses. But when they encounter someone who's emotionally mature, someone who can regulate their own emotions instead of projecting them, they experience something rare: love without pressure. And that's when they finally start to let their guard down. Because what they fear most isn't love itself. It's emotional chaos. Maturity communicates safety, and safety communicates freedom. Now, here's the part most people overlook. Emotional maturity doesn't mean being emotionless. It means being aware enough to know when your fear is talking instead of your love. It means knowing when you're reacting from insecurity instead of connection. With an avoidant, this awareness is everything. Because every time you respond calmly, instead of demanding closeness, you teach their nervous system that intimacy doesn't have to come with emotional volatility. You show them that love can be steady, that it doesn't have to feel like drowning. It's also about emotional responsibility, understanding that their behavior may trigger your wounds, but it's not your job to fix theirs. Emotional maturity says, I can love you and still hold myself accountable for my reactions. It creates a powerful balance, empathy without enmeshment. That's what shifts the relationship dynamic from anxious pursuit to mutual respect. The avoidant begins to sense that they're not being controlled, they're being met. And that's when the reciprocity begins. When you grow emotionally, the energy between you changes. Avoidants start mirroring what they feel safe around. They begin showing up differently, not because you convince them to, but because your stability redefines what love feels like. It's not about saying the right thing or following a strategy. It's about embodying a new vibration, one that signals emotional maturity, self-respect, and peace. The truth is, avoidants are deeply attuned to emotional undercurrents. They can sense neediness even when it's unspoken. They can feel when love comes with an agenda. But when love is clean, when it's free from emotional bargaining, they're drawn to it, even if they don't understand why. It feels different. It feels safe. That's when they start to engage more openly, take emotional risks, and express what they've spent years suppressing. Psychologically, what's happening is that your emotional maturity helps co-regulate their attachment system. Every time you choose calm over chaos, self-reflection over accusation, you're subtly teaching their brain that intimacy doesn't equal danger. You're showing them that emotional connection can exist without control or collapse. This is how avoidance begins to heal, not through confrontation, but through consistent exposure to emotional stability. Philosophically, this speaks to something bigger than just relationships. It speaks to the nature of love as an evolving consciousness. Love matures when both people do. It shifts from instinct to intention, from survival to growth. Emotional maturity is that bridge. It turns love from something reactive into something deliberate. It's what transforms "I need you to complete me" into "I choose to share myself with you." And that's the difference between conditional love and conscious love. Conditional love says, "I'll feel secure when you change." Conscious love says, "I'll stay secure while I change." The first traps both people in dependency. The second frees both people to grow. And growth is what awakens an avoidant heart. They start to realize that love doesn't have to cost them their identity. It can actually deepen it. When they see you handle emotional friction with maturity, when you can discuss your needs without guilt, express your boundaries without punishment, and navigate conflict without emotional warfare, they begin to see love as something sustainable, something they can trust. And trust, for them, is the gateway to affection. It's the invisible moment where fear turns into desire and distance turns into closeness. But here's the challenge. Emotional maturity requires discipline. It asks you to stay centered even when it's easier to react. It requires you to be self-aware enough to stop making someone else responsible for your peace. That's hard work, but it's also the work that changes not just your relationship, but your entire experience of love. Because emotional maturity isn't about being perfect. It's about being conscious. It's about showing up with honesty, humility, and accountability. In the end, emotional maturity doesn't just attract the avoidant. It awakens them. It meets them at the level where real intimacy begins, the level where love is no longer about fixing or proving, but about mutual evolution. And when both people reach that point, the dynamic stops being about fear altogether. It becomes about freedom. Two whole individuals choosing each other, not out of need, but out of alignment. Timing plays a far greater role in love than most of us like to admit, especially with avoidance. You can't rush their realization. You can't persuade them into emotional openness. And you can't shortcut the process of self-confrontation they need to go through. Avoidants only admit their love when something inside them changes, when they've gone through an internal transformation that makes closeness feel like a choice, not a threat. That's why timing matters. Love doesn't unfold in the middle of chaos. It surfaces in the calm that comes after it. For an avoidant, emotional closeness is terrifying until it's not, until the dynamic shifts, until the fear loses its grip, until both people have grown enough to stop playing the old chase and flee game. That transformation doesn't happen because someone finally wins the other person over. It happens when both sides evolve, when the anxious partner stops chasing validation and the avoidant stops running from connection. Only then does the space for love to breathe truly open up. You see, an avoidant doesn't confess their feelings when the relationship is still caught in emotional tension. They admit love when they finally feel that the relationship no longer threatens their independence. When they look at you and see a partner, not a pursuer. When they sense that being close to you doesn't mean losing themselves. It's not about manipulation or playing it cool. It's about equilibrium. When the energy between you becomes balanced, their fear transforms into awareness. This is where personal growth becomes the foundation for timing. You can't pull someone into emotional maturity. You have to meet them there. That means focusing less on when they'll come around and more on who you are when they do. Because the moment you stop living in reaction to their distance, you change the entire dynamic. You create the calm that invites honesty. You become the safe ground where love can finally land. Most people don't realize that timing in relationships isn't about clocks. It's about readiness. You can meet the right person at the wrong level of consciousness, and it still won't work. You can have chemistry, connection, even shared dreams, but if one or both people are operating from fear, that love won't have room to grow. Avoidants, in particular, can only love when they're emotionally ready to let go of control. That readiness can't be forced. It can only be realized. And that realization usually comes after some form of loss. After the avoidant sees that distance doesn't bring peace, it brings emptiness. After they recognize that solitude doesn't always equal safety, and that connection doesn't always equal pain. It's a deep internal reckoning, one that often happens when the anxious energy that used to surround them disappears. When they're no longer being chased, they finally have space to feel. That's when clarity hits. Not because you convinced them, but because life did. Philosophically, this speaks to one of the great paradoxes of human connection. Love can't be forced, but it also can't be avoided forever. It's an inevitable truth that waits for the right alignment. Timing isn't passive. It's an active unfolding of emotional readiness. Both people have to evolve beyond survival mode. They have to stop needing love to complete them and start choosing love to expand them. And for avoidance, that shift from avoidance to allowance is everything. It's what makes them finally say, I love you, not as a confession, but as a surrender. When that moment happens, it's not dramatic. It's quiet, grounded, almost serene. It doesn't come from fear of losing you. It comes from the peace of finally understanding themselves. That's the kind of love that lasts. Because it's not born out of anxiety or urgency. It's born out of mutual awareness. Both people standing in their own strength, choosing connection over control. And here's what's most liberating about this truth. Once you understand that timing is tied to transformation, you stop waiting and start living. You stop trying to make the relationship happen, and you start becoming the kind of person who's ready for the relationship when it does. You start focusing on your own healing, your own boundaries, your own peace. And in that process, you create the stillness where clarity, yours and theirs, can finally emerge. When you reach that level of emotional independence, you stop needing closure from them because you already have it within yourself. You stop needing the confession because your peace is no longer attached to their timing. And ironically, that's when timing tends to align, because you've stopped interfering with it. The calm you cultivate becomes the invitation they can finally trust. So if you're wondering when the avoidant will finally admit their love, understand this. It won't happen during the storm. It will happen after the lessons, after the silence, after the emotional noise settles and both people can finally hear themselves again. That's when the truth surfaces, not as a reaction, but as recognition. Because love, for avoidance, doesn't appear when you chase it. It arrives when both hearts have done enough healing to receive it, when fear has burned off enough to make space for freedom, when love stops being a battlefield and becomes a choice made in peace.